to speak with the doctoral students who will be the next generation of the scholars. So I'll be talking to you as I'm thinking about our doctoral study years. And I am sort of like going to ignore Janice and Angela and I know you are secondary. So I'll be talking about my work around the NGSS and language, but also interject with some of my years and experiences as a doctoral student and as a young scholar and moving up. So I would like to relate to doctoral students as the primary interest. So here comes the NGSS, and we'll be talking about science and language. And NGSS is the counterpart of a Common Core. Science just wants to be independent, so we don't use a Common Core, but we use the next generation of Star Trek and Captain Picard. Before I start, from 1 meaning very little, 2 meaning some, and 3 meaning a lot, I would like to ask you to raise your finger, not the 1, but the properly. Am I doing okay with my English? All right. 1 meaning very little, and 2 meaning a lot, and 2 moderately and 3 a lot. Raise your hand, thumb if you know just a little. About NGSS. NGSS, 2 moderately, 3 a lot. All right, 0, none. Okay, also you have some knowledge. I will be talking about 2 topics in particular. One is, what are the instructional shifts around the NGSS? And I'm going to focus on 3 major shifts. One is a 3-dimensional learning. The other one is a focus on explaining phenomena for science and designing solutions to problems for engineering. So science and engineering are equal partners in the standards. And coherence, or in other words, learning progressions across time, meaning K through 12. And then I would like to talk about what science means along with the language for all students with a focus on English language learners. So 3 instructional shifts. Just as a very brief background of the NGSS, there were standing that about 29 of them were practitioners, either as the classroom teachers, district or the state supervisors, with the intent that the focus of the NGSS is implementation, practicality, feasibility, something that can be done, not just the theoretical. There were private sector engineers, so it's a wide representation of the people. NGSS were released in 2013 April, so I guess we are celebrating about 3 years by now. To date, 17 states, it's actually 18 states. Hawaii just adopted it, so it's 18 states, it's changing all the time. I was thinking it would be nice to be invited to Hawaii so I can travel there. All right, so 18 states, including New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the few states early on, and DC have, I think we're expecting about 20-some states soon, and then it'll gradually grow to some extent. But even if those states that may not adopt the NGSS will still be embracing the notion of the framework document, which is the National Research Council document that demonstrates what is a good science a student should know and be able to do, and then how science. So that's the NRC document that provides the foundation of the NGSS. New York has some sort of adaptation of the NGSS. It's a very tricky, it's a very close, but not quite. So we are going to see 50 shades of white and black and gray in between. So that means in New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Connecticut, a lot of the eastern states have adopted it. So you're in good company of the many states in the neighboring states. Building on the past, preparing for the future. So this is something that I reflect on my own doctoral program and the academic career. So the Science for All Americans by the AAAS was published in 1989. And 1989 was when I got my doctoral degree. So my academic career started with the previous generation of the science standards. And then in 1996 of National Science Education Standards, so I was the bystander just thinking, oh, those are the standards. And then over time, by the National Research Council, there was a series of documents that talk about the taking science to school, informal science education, high school laboratory that provide a foundation for what science means. And I became part of the committee for taking science to school. So you can see that I was moving up from a new doctoral student in 1989 to be part of the committee to write about the taking science to school. And then came, in 2011, the framework document by the National Research Council. And that document summarizes the two key points. You can imagine that the AAAS was published in 1989, and the NRC document was published in 2011, and that's about 20 years. And according to Korean tradition where I am from, a decade is the time that the world changes. That means for the period of 2 decades, the world has changed twice. So the new standards are reflecting the new changes of science disciplines, but also our new understanding of how children learn science. Now, then came and here is also what I would like to relate to doctoral students. So when I got a call from Stephen Pruitt saying that, okay, we would like to invite you to lead the NGSS Diversity and Equity team, I had two choices. Either I would continue criticizing the standards by saying that equity and diversity issues were not addressed, or just to say, do something about it and then make the contribution. So guess what I did? I said, all right, I'll be very happy. So I decided to be the target of potential critiques and criticisms. That's how you plunge into trouble. You get that? So I said, sure. So that changed my life along with then right now we are having a lot of work to do. So assessments, curricula, instruction, teacher development policy, they are all in the works. And you can imagine that New Jersey is one of the states that is taking the lead for all these tasks. And for science colleagues, New Jersey just announced the MST program, right, for teacher enhancement. The announcement just came out. All right, so 3 instructional shifts. One is a 3-dimensional learning by saying scientific and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts and disparate ideas. The second is a focus on explaining phenomena or designing solutions to problems. And the third is a coherence and learning progressions across time. So I'll talk one at a time. 3-dimensional learning. It's a blending of 3 dimensions by blending, intertwining practices, the way scientists and engineers engage in their careers, cross-cutting concepts that cut across all the science disciplines, and disparate ideas are key ideas that define each discipline. And what is important about the blending of 3 dimensions is that traditionally, for all the previous standards, as good as they are, it's typically the case that the focus was on content. You learn the content of the water cycle, photosynthesis, you learn the content. And it would be great if you do inquiry, but that's nice, but it is not essential. But it's a content. And content is so easy to assess because all you need is a multiple choice questions to do. The new standards by the team of, actually the NRC committee of 18 members that consist of 19 science disciplinary people, all of them academy members, including 3 notified members. That's the way they define the science of what is important to know. So it's a blending of the 3 things, not just the one. Just very briefly, practice include those 8 practices. It's just defining the science inquiry that was the focus of the previous standards. the science inquiry was very nebulous and ambiguous, and it's almost like an elephant that people had different interpretations of what science inquiry means. So these people say that when we say science inquiry, these are the important practices that scientists and engineers engage in. So those are 8, and some of them, many of them overlap for science and engineering, but a couple of them are unique. Those are 8 cross-cutting concepts: patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, stability and change. What is important about the cross-cutting concepts is that traditionally, those were the understanding that advanced students might get when they are smart enough to figure it out. But most students may not have any access to that because they take a physical science and life science and earth science and they get pieces, but nothing across the science disciplines that cut across. So let me pick one: cause and effect. So if you do something, the effect happens across the disciplines. What is interesting about cause and effect, you can even extend it to, for example, literary. The way I think of it is that I'm going to Randy. So if you think about Shakespeare, Romeo did something, and that has a consequence on Juliet. So it's not just the science disciplines, but those are the cross-cutting concepts that cut across the disciplines. Systems and system models. Our body is a system. My body has organ system, different system. So my left shoulder hurts, and because it hurts the whole thing here. So I'm realizing how important the system is, the subsystems. It's the first disciplinary core ideas: physical sciences, life sciences, earth-space sciences. A couple of important things: physical science. So you can see matter and forces and energy. PS4, it's a waves, information transfer. That caused a little bit of stirred a little bit of a controversy of the why waves. It's about the sound wave, the light wave, X-rays, gamma rays, ultra rays. And that's for information transfer, and that's for the next generation, so the US can compete with the Korea. Life sciences, there is enough to cause trouble, and that is the last one: evolution. It's unequivocally in. At earth-space science, there is earth and human activity, that human activities contribute to climate change, and climate change is a new topic of evolution. And that might be a little bit of a controversy to some states for the adoption. And engineering technology, engineering is as important as science. So when you look at physical science, life science, earth-space science, and engineering, there is one area that is revolutionary. And then on top of all those, NGSS decided to address diversity and equity as the focal point, because given the demographic changes in the nation, that it has to be all students, but not those bright students who will go to science and engineer as a spotlight. So in a sense, if we do it right, it can be much more revolutionary than spotlight reform, and that's the intent of it. Three-dimensional learning, so what does it look like? So people have been thinking about the analogy. Analogy is very important in science. Analogy is important in ELA too. Right, so my colleague Vera Jelisek thought that, well, for example, you have a tools, that's how to do things, science. You have to know the game basics of a core or whatever, and then that's a core idea. And then you have to have a good sportsmanship so that you don't cheat and do anything bad and wrong. And then you play golf. When you play golf, you cannot do one at a time. You have to do all three things at the same time. That's the analogy. If you think of that analogy as a man or a woman, there's a different version of it. So here is a Joe Krychek in your colleagues. Analogy. So he loves to cook. He will say that kitchen tools are practices that you know how to use them, but you have to have a good ingredient, which is a core idea. That it's a little bit of herbs and spices, and then you prepare the meal for Thanksgiving. And my analogy is that when you teach, if you add a little bit of a love and candle, They'll be even nice. That's the love of the students. So that's the analogy. The instructional shift, so I just talked about 3 dimensions very briefly for those who raised either 1 or 0. And then we're moving on to the next one, which is focus on explaining phenomena for science, but designing solutions to problems like engineering. That as much as 3-dimensional learning is evolutionary or revolutionary, that's not an end in and of itself. It is a means to do something with it. And to do something with it is figuring things out, finding an explanation, but do something with it. So that's where the focus on explaining or solutions come in, to do something with the 3 dimensions. So, phenomenon or problem. We are all hunting for good phenomena that we can wrap our arms around to say, this is what science is about. So according to the Google, it says a phenomenon, and the second one will say something about, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question. That's the phenomenon. So instead of saying there is light waves or whatever, how do you explain the double rainbow? This is a double rainbow twice, and that's just really emotional, beautiful. Oh, how does it happen? Why does it happen? The second is ants. Ants are doing something, and ants relate to all the other things. I'm working with the California colleagues, and it turned out that Argentinian ants are actually invasive species that are killing the native species. So that goes into life science. The third is a shadow. Shadow would be, what topic would that be? Space science. Why do we have a shadow? The last is deforestation. What will happen if we continue that? And how do we solve the problem? That's the spirit of the NGSS. So what is the phenomenon or problem? So you have the phenomenon. We experience the phenomenon. If you think of it as a big, some people may think of it as an empty phenomenon, but something, a major phenomenon. And what is the event that in the world that we wanted to explain or wanted to figure out? Then that drives the driving question. Okay, here is a phenomenon, and we would like to know, and we would like to find out. So what is the driving question? So it starts with a phenomenon and the driving question, and then smaller phenomena, sub-questions, and that's the way the science instruction is being guided from the phenomena to the question. Now, I am strongly advocating for community-based phenomena. Community. Not that fish in Lake Michigan 30 years ago, or not Galapagos many years ago. Possible for middle or high school students, the students who are new to science, elementary students, students who haven't had the access to science and engineering. I am advocating for community. Why community? And here is my rationale of a community. So because it touches upon diversity and science at the same time. In terms of diversity, community-based phenomenon creates a relevance to students. It's respecting the diversity of the community. Community-based phenomenon also utilize the funds of knowledge that students bring to the classroom. So I consider that as a cultural resources. When you have a community-based phenomenon that my parents and sisters and brothers and neighbors talk about and experience, that is something that I can talk about. That's a linguistic resources that all have the access to talk about something that we all experience together. Also, community-based phenomenon promotes inclusion because everybody has something to contribute rather than those smart students have something to say and the others who do not have the science knowledge or vocabulary may not be able to even access. So that would be my advocating for diversity. Now, science phenomenon, if it's big enough, then it should be able to integrate multiple science disciplines over quite some time. It should be able to relate to engineering so that it's solving the problem as an engineering issue in local context. And it's even better if it's something about the current concerns. So one example, so I'm hunting for phenomenon, tons of interesting examples. I just would like to say that one of my colleagues is doing squirrels. Squirrels, beautiful, right? Kids love squirrels. According to her research, it says the squirrels have not changed their genetics for the past 500 million years. Something. But it is interacting with the environment. So at the University of Chicago, there is a citizen science project. So third grade students are collecting data about squirrels and communicating with university people about the community issue of squirrels. See that? No. So in our case, I'll talk a little more later. Explain a phenomenon and an example. So do you see the first one? Randy, I kept it. This is the garbage. This is the garbage, right? I'm throwing it into garbage can. And everybody throws garbage in. And all the garbage is on the street and it goes into a landfill or incinerator. So the question is, the phenomenon, our school makes tons of garbage every day. And this garbage persists in landfill over a long period of time. So the driving question is, what happens to our garbage? So I can throw out this food item, or I'll be ashamed that I will throw out this non-food item. And they all go to a landfill. And what happens to them? So here is, I said something about performance expectations. Performance expectations are what we expect the students to know and be able to do by the end of the year or instruction. So it's a summative assessment of performance. It's a summative learning or more summative for garbage unit. This is only an example. You may say garbage. So we are framing garbage as a part of a physical science. You may say, what does garbage have anything to do with the physical science? Suppose that I leave this banana for about the 3 weeks. What do you think will happen? Decomposes? And what is that awful smell? When you say smell, is it smell something or nothing? It's a something. How do we know? It's a guess. What is your evidence? So that's where we are going with garbage as physical science of smell, with a smell as something, the particle nature matter. Then let's see. It decomposes in a bottle, and after 3 or 4 weeks, it's gone. What do you think the kids will say about weight? Weighs less, or weighs the same, or weighs more? In a closed system, it should weigh the same. That's a conservation of weight. If it's an open system, it should weigh less because you're losing matter. That's a conservation of the matter. Let's see. And then what it happens is that when it goes brown, then it goes through chemical reaction, then it changes the color. If it sits long enough, like in rain right now, and the water goes through, eventually you have a juicy, meaty thing, and that's a chemical change. You see that? This one, I feel bad. I'll throw it away, and it's going to affect the environment because it's not going to disappear. It stays. This one decomposes, and that's a decomposition, and that's the beginning of the ecosystem. Because decomposition is part of bacteria doing the work, there's microbes, but ants could be, and then mushrooms could be. So that's how. Now that we have all of this, and I feel really bad for throwing this out because they are not going to decompose and do not disappear. So I'm contributing to the problem of the environment, and I feel really bad. So that's the garbage unit. That's a phenomenon. And we are putting all the physical science concepts around that leads into life science, and earth science. Let's see. Can I do that? It's garbage. Instructional shifts. I'm going to do it a little faster. So we talked about three-dimensional learning, focus on phenomena and designing solutions to problems. But what about children in grade 1, grade 5, grade 8, and 10? How do we proceed? That's a learning progression of coherence across time. So here is a coherence or learning progressions for performance expectation. Think of performance expectation as a standard. What NGSS, so this is different topic, focuses on is that we do not want it to do the same thing again and again. That's what Bill Schmidt would say, that a mile wide and an inch deep. Not that. Let's go with some width, but much deeper over the years. So here is one example. So here is a grade 1, physical science, core idea 4. So first grade students make observations to construct that practice, an evidence-based account explanation. So they are evidence. Object in darkness can be seen, that's not light. Great. Again, another one, performance expectation. They go into grade 4. Grade 4 students develop a model to describe that light reflecting from objects and entering the eye. That's a grade 4. Now, when you go to middle school, it says that develop and use a model to describe that waves are reflected, absorbed, and transmitted. When you go to high school, whoa, evaluate the claims, evidence, and reasoning behind the idea that electromagnetic radiation. So when you teach at grade 10, the K through 2, if you miss it, when students go to grades 3, 4, 5, they will have to do the miss it. And if you miss science entirely, then middle school students will have to do the middle school, but they have to start from the elementary. So learning progression, the coherence is so important because it's a building from the lower grade into higher grade, very logically and conceptually richer. So it's the same idea fundamentally, but it's a sophisticated ideas from grade K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. That's the learning progression idea. You get it? Beautiful? I think it's beautiful. All right. Then here is a grade 1. Grade 1, so that there's a clarification statement. Examples are, and here's a grade 4. And here's one example. So what I just showed you, performance expectation. How do you see an object? Typically, when you read a textbook, it will say light is reflected off an object and enters the eye, and you remember that. I think I remember that from school. That's my undergraduate students will say. I don't know exactly what it means, but I think. In the NGSS, it's not that. It's asking the students to provide the evidence and reasoning for the claim that they're making. So here is the initial model. Students draw something. I can't see anything, and then draw. And then instruction continues for some time. And then the students do the consensus model, light reflecting off and enters the eye. Fourth grade. Here is a beautiful artwork. I know you're going to say beautiful. The student gets an A+ for art. That's given. So what is really important is that there is a light, and light is reflected all over, and it's a light is going entering the eye. But this student even wrote the explanation. He or she wrote, light travels in through the flap, open space, and reflects off of a tuck, that's the name of the turtle, into our eye, so that we can see. If you don't have the model, and if the student writes that way, we do not know whether the student is repeating the text information or really understands. But here, he is showing the evidence in the model. Then tuck, okay, see the tuck. Number 2, 1 and 2. The light reflects everywhere, and comes to us and lights up top. So he explains in two different ways. Would you be convinced that the student really understands the concept? That's a model. Then here is learning progressions, cross-disciplinary core ideas. So here we go. That's what we saw. K through 2, don't touch. 3 through 5, 6 through 8, 9 to 12. That's how learning progression continues through K through 12. That's for every disciplinary core idea that it is explained that way. And then there is also develop a model, which is a practice. Disciplinary core idea is a one dimension. Another dimension is a practice. So in this case, the students develop a model. They draw the vision, the light. And then here we say that grade K through 2 through 3 through 5, middle school and high school. And for the practice of developing a model, the learning progression becomes much more sophisticated over the years. So it's may draw, but then develop a model becomes not just that, but it's a conceptual. It is explaining why, and it should be able to predict what will happen. So it's not simply drawing beautifully, but it's an idea, concept. Here are the practices. 8 of them, they are all related. Here is, I'm just extending in response to Randy's request. Here we go. So it's not just the science practices. Actually, the practices apply to ELA and math in a synergistic manner. So Common Core has about 7 practices that students should be able to, the capacities of the students when they engage in ELA. Math will say that it's not only mathematical concepts, but also mathematical practices. So we have math, we have science, and we have ELA. Then how much overlap there is, you can see overlap between math and science and ELA, math and ELA, and you have and that's build a strong base of knowledge. Okay. That means in ELA, E2, it's a building knowledge across content areas. It's all about informational text, nonfiction. It's about ELA in content areas. There is a synergy. Now, when you look down, you are going to see it's about evidence, argument and critique, reasoning, engaging argument and evidence. It's all about argument. And argument seems to be the center. So here is my catchphrase. If you visit a classroom that is supposed to be expected to be very effective, it should be very noisy. Because who is talking? Kids. That should be very noisy. Argue. But what counts as argument, what counts as evidence that cuts across the disciplines is something that I hope that the doctoral students will undertake as a dissertation studies, because it is something that we propose, that ELA proposes argument and evidence, math proposes argument and evidence, science proposes argument and evidence, but we don't quite know what that means across the disciplines. So in a sense, here's a conundrum that all the standards are proposing argument and evidence and expect the teachers to be able to do. But we do not provide the guidance on how they are similar different. So it's a really a need to be able to do sort of meaningful practices. We're asking a lot of the classroom teachers. Here is again learning progressions of a coherence. That's a cause and effect, which is a discrete idea, and the same idea that K through 2, 3 through 5, middle school and high school, and that learning progression that applies to cause and effect applies to all the others. So you can imagine that the idea of learning progressions applies to each discrete idea, applies to each of the 8 practices, and applies to each of the 7 cross-cutting concepts. You get that? K to 12. Thank you, Nabi. All right, so let me say just a little bit about science and language. So what does science and language have to do with each other? It's a raising the bar for content, academically rigorous. It's a raising the bar for language. It's a language intensive, and it's a calling for a high level of a classroom discourse for all students, including else and there. In addition to the NGSS, I would like to include Understanding Language Initiative that's located at Stanford. And it's an initiative where the second language acquisition scholars would like to gather, convene the content people so that we can think about language opportunities, but also language demands that are expected of all students, particularly ELs, so that we do not add additional burden, but instead capitalize on the opportunities for all students. Okay, so why language is so important? Here is the thing. Think about, for example, engaging an argument. When you engage in argument, what is the mechanism that you engage in argument? What mechanism? Language. You construct an explanation. What is the mechanism of constructing an explanation? Language. You develop a model and use a model. What is the mechanism of developing a model? Some sort of a diagram, graphs, charts, and that's multiple modes of, again, language. It's all about language. So language is so critical and the core of the science standards, but also ELA and math. It's all about language. So language is really key. So here is another diagram that you can think of. Here is the old paradigm. Content was there, language was there. When we thought about the language, we typically thought of a language as learning grammar and learning vocabulary and speaking like native speaker. I remember learning German and Korean when I was in school, and the first sentence that we learned is that this is a desk in German. And I have no idea why I had to learn this sentence, because that's important to get started with that. So we typically think of a language learning as vocabulary and grammar and speaking like. That used to be. When you have that, there is a little overlap between content and language, and they are two silos. When you think about the discourse, modeling, explanation, argumentation, text complexity, which is all about ELA reading, text structure, sentence structure, vocabulary, and grammar, then content and language overlap so much more. So that now that even the science people are thinking of language. So one example. There was a test item about what is the most likely to happen, most likely. And they analyzed the student responses to most likely to happen. And how do you think the ELA L students might interpret most likely to happen? They interpret the question as I like the most likely. Most likely as a statistical question became like the most. So all those things can really be problematic unless we pay attention to the role of the language in continuity. If you combine all three together, here's a math and language, science and language, and then ELA and language. And language is a glue, especially for practices. Language serves the purpose that put all three areas of the practices together. So here is our current work. It's a mouthful, language focused, three-dimensional, that means NGSS, instructional materials to support English language learners in particular in 5th grade. And my colleagues are Guadalupe, Second Language Acquisition Colleague, Helen Quinn, the chair of the framework document, who is a theoretical physicist. So I'm learning a whole bunch from her. California and New Jersey, because we didn't have any NGSS. I was very grateful and surprised when Union News Daily said that NYU and Steinhardt got NSF funding to come to work with us. And I would not have said the district until they made it public. So They are coming to New Jersey, our neighboring state, pretty soon. Um, Language use, here is engage in argument from evidence. When you think about language science, you have to do something about claim and evidence and reasoning from science perspective. But when you do the argumentation, it's a deceptive language and productive language as a function. So that you do science, but you also use language to do. So you're doing science and using language go together. Right now, I'm producing and you are receiving. For the Q&A, you'll be producing language and I'll be responding to you. So that's, we engage in the communication that happens through receptive language, but there is the task in the discipline, in this case, the engage in argument. So the design principles that are guiding for our work, here is a science. So you can imagine that we are doing phenomenon, three-dimensional learning and coherence over time. The language, it's about how to use the language for L's at different levels in different classrooms. And assessment, it's a 3D assessment and assessment of the language altogether. Wish us good luck when we get it right. What happens to our garbage is our first unit. So we have been doing the development of the garbage that I talked about. So I'm going to share just a few thoughts on garbage unit before I close. So we are all pretty honest and committed people on the project. But we come from physical side, I mean the physics, science education with a diversity focus, and second language acquisition, and language assessment. And then we also have a free consultants who were the NGSS writers. So it's a collection of people who are really committed to science with a focus on language. And it has been really interesting and enlightening because these disciplines have different assumptions of what is effective. Not because we are nasty people, but just that we represent a different disciplines, different thoughts. So constantly issues emerge as we just start talking. So let me share just a couple of thoughts of what are those emerging issues for our attention. And I feel very committed to sharing these issues so that we can inform the field of when you do this type of work, you may face these issues as you engage in argument explanation. So one example, garbage unit. Learning progression. The fifth grade topics include matter, ecosystems, earth systems, and solar systems. It's a very heavy on systems and system models. The issue of learning progressions involves both the science and language because we expect the students to go through the learning progressions in science the same way of learning progressions in language over time, every unit and over the course of the year. So when we thought about matter, Helen King, he said, you know, I'm a physicist and matter is my love. But when I think about matter, the way matter has been taught, it's just so abstract. And it's activity by activity. And I cannot imagine else having much meaningful discussion of the matter the way it has been taught. When I think about ecosystem, it's about the plants and ants, and I can see the students having much more community-based and relevance to their everyday life. But if you would like to do ecosystem, then you have to go back to matter because ecosystem is about changing gas and all that. So do we start with ecosystem and go back, physical science, and then back again, or what? And when someone said garbage, and at the meeting, I was just eating banana. That's the coincidence. I was thinking, the smell, the rotten, the decomposition. Garbage, Helen, here is a banana. And Helen said, yep, garbage can work. So we negotiated the topic of matter, not because of the science. It's a fundamental concept, but it's hard to do the way it has been taught. So we debate at every turn of what would be the implications for language and language. So garbage, everybody has something to say, great. And our language colleague said, that can work, so that's our agreement. So we're very happy about it. I would like to say something about funny though. My colleague would say that garbage, great. If we do the work right, the garbage would be phenomenally good. But it could be really garbage, really bad. So that's a play of it. Garbage. So there is another issue that we also struggling with. And the question is, so the first one is about learning progressions of science and math. The second is language support. So science and language practices involve the use of a language and providing the fluence for else. How do we provide the language support for else, especially beginning level else, without giving the punchline of science? So here comes all the controversy of we wanted to do bilingual education, are we doing translanguaging, how much demands that may impose on the teachers, what would be realistic in terms of just a realistic implementation as a policy, instructional materials. And we have to make our decision on to what extent bilingual and translanguaging. And even then, suppose that a teacher is teaching this garbage unit, and my students are mostly beginning level else. I need to model language because I may be the only or one of the few language model, which is different from a classroom full of students where there are a lot more native speakers where students learn from. So that's another tension of how do you model so that you are describing what it is, but not telling students what it is. So at every turn that we are addressing issue, there is another thing. So that's where we are right now. 5 minutes over, but not too bad. So thank you for listening. I mean, nodding and smiling and all stays. Thank you. Any questions? All right.
So I'm interested in the learning progressions from kindergarten to high school. And when you're doing fifth grade for your study, so I'm wondering, it may not be so important in fifth grade. Are fifth grade teachers elementary, or are they like high school, or do they have like a science endorsement?
Elementary.
Elementary. Okay, so this is my question because a lot of what you said applies, I think, to mathematics as well, and that's my discipline. So my question is, what kind of supports do you anticipate having to give your elementary school science teachers so that they can understand their curriculum, what they're learning, what they have to teach, and how it affects high school, since they're really not science specialists.
High school? You say how elements?
So how what they have to teach in science in elementary and fifth grade, how or have you talked about how to support them in understanding what they're doing and how it moves on to higher level science in high school?
So there are two issues. One is that because of the learning progressions, for every performance expectation we do, we have to think about what students should bring from K through 2. And then the grade band they are working with, and then where they are going for middle school. So it's this roadmap of where they came from, where they are, and where they are heading toward. So for that, it is very important for every PE that you have the learning progressions so that you know the roadmap. That's one. The second is that the NGSS will say clarification statement that this is the expectation for grade 5, but these are kinds of things, ideas are beyond the grade 5, so don't teach, so stay within. So don't go too far, but rigorous. I think learning progressions, one other thing I have a lot to say. Even though science learning progressions seem to be very logical, actually the research base for learning progressions is quite limited. We do have a learning progressions for major topics like the matter and evolution, some topics, but not all. So these are the best estimations of the writers and consultation with other people on what we expect. So all the learning progressions that we have are actually open for empirical investigations. That's one. Another, we do not know exactly the reactions of elementary school teachers to this approach are very open and demanding and meaning making because it's not commonly done. Not only that, it's a meaning making of the science and it's a meaning making of the language. So we are doing two things at the same time. So we are very mindful of that demands on the teachers. So we are hoping that the teachers will be excited about not just the teaching the content is so boring, but doing something with the practices so that it's engaging the students. So that's what we're hoping for. We will be working with the teachers as a consultant throughout. So we have a couple of years to develop, but we will be working from the get-go. One last thing, I know. You can see that I have been thinking. So when we say science and language, there is two other layers of implementation. One other layer of the issue is that translating science and language in the schooling language that teachers are familiar. And then one other thing is within the policy context of how much demands that we can have. In California, for example, science is taught very little because of the demands for Common Core. So how is using is an issue, instructional time. So you have a science and language and schooling language, and then there is a policy language, multiple languages. I consider that my only one desire is that we do honest work and share the tensions and issues to the field, with the field, so that we can say we have learned these things. Keeps me awake at night. But thank you.
So I'm thinking about how we can enrich our own design activities. So you mentioned community-based activities as a way to engage the kids in lots of languages, and talking about watching language choices like being misinterpreted as like the most. Also, you mentioned the importance of teachers modeling in classes where there won't be enough other students to model. Oh, I'm wondering about other approaches. Are you exploring scaffolds that support students' language during activities and other techniques that those of us who are engaged in design and want to be able to support English language learning? Are there scaffolds that you're trying out that you would recommend at this point?
You're just scratching the surface right now. So one response I can think of is that science scaffolding for both science and language. Science in the standards document, we say ask questions. And when science people say ask questions, that means you raise a question that you can investigate, that collect the data. That leads into investigation, but in the classroom setting, that investigation will be within the classroom setting, not beyond. So we have a subject. When our language colleagues thought of asking questions, that raises a whole different set of issues. So the set of issues will be that asking question has the receptive and the productive language as a language functions. That's really one. The second issue would be that we expect the students to be able to ask questions. That's what science people expect and think of. But then second language acquisition colleagues may say that not all students may be ready to ask questions because they haven't practiced or it's not the cultural norm. So it's not just asking questions, modeling, but it also be, it's okay, it's a cultural understanding of it. That might be an issue. That's another. Asking questions also put me in the context of schooling language. That teachers may think of asking questions from the text and they get the information from the text and reading comprehension. So there seems to be not just the science asking question, but the second language acquisition question, cultural issue, language issue. But we may have a more understanding in about a year, but we're just engaging in what does linguistic scaffolding mean. A whole lot more from the beginning. But what we do understand at this point of our challenge is that for English language learners, if you are surrounded by many of the reading level L's who are very beginning, you can imagine a teacher, I'm just thinking, you can imagine a teacher starting the garbage unit at a school cafeteria, having the garbage can and sorting and sitting, right? So using the rake and describing what I'm doing. Here is a plastic cup, and here is a plastic bottle, and here is food item, and I'm doing categorizing, putting the food item here, and here is an orange piece, and here is apple piece, and they start from there. But how to describe the nut counting, and how to raise a question that all students have a say without giving the question to the student. I mean, so that's a message.
Thank you. We need to invite you back again next year.
Yeah, 2 years. So one more? You got it. So I've been thinking a lot about these issues, and my postdoc is sitting right here, and I are working on a paper right now about this. But so, I mean, there's a whole issue, there's a competency performance distinction in how well people can articulate what it is they know. So there's knowing science in the full complement that you've described, the practices, the content knowledge, the cross-cutting concepts, and then there's the ability to articulate it. And where I'm really starting to get very concerned, and where we have very robust data, is that students' variance, individual difference, irrespective of whether they're in their first language or not, their capacity or their skill at describing what they know about science is incredibly broad, right? And I really worry about this when there are many practices, as there should be, around argumentation, explanation, communicating findings in NGSS, but many of those students' knowledge is not getting fully assessed if we're using language-based methods. So just to tip our hand a little bit, we're writing a paper right now that shows that students have these very rich understandings of science in their log files, as evidenced by the data mined algorithms that we use. But their capacity or skill at articulating that is exceptionally poor. So these are our math and science geniuses that we're tossing out on the street, okay? Mm-hmm. Similarly, we have a whole cadre of students who are really good at talking the talk, but their log file is a total mess. They've heard something, they can parrot it back, they're getting a great grade, and those students are not being properly tutored, right? And the amount of kids who fall into those quadrants are exceedingly large. So my question to you is, I really hope your project can accommodate, students' skills and build, as Clark said, scaffolds to help develop those competencies. But that's not a trivial thing. No, I mean, we're talking about, major barriers to communication. Mm-hmm. And if we have a core set of practices, many of which focus on explanation, but these students are really going to be have a hard time meeting AYP on NGSS. There's a whole issue of scalability of those measures as well, but I'll stay away from that since that's one of my favorite topics to pick at. But so I really worry about those students.
I think we are just starting to think about three-dimensional assessment as a state, as a consortium of states that are working on NGSS assessment, and then a few research projects on three-dimensional assessment, and I think that's a whole different topic, and that I think we need a lot more movement. I think it's an issue.
Yeah.
Three-dimensional assessment also is that because you are expecting performance to be able to do the practice, that cannot be just a paper and pencil test. It requires some, and that means a lot of resources and a lot more opens up. It's a whole different issue. It's an issue. But may I add one more thing? So thank you. I will learn from you about how the issue. One thing that I would like to say about the language scaffolding is this. That just like in the past, that science was taught as a content, as much more static and sterile. Likewise, language used to be vocabulary and grammar, and sentence frames and structure, because these kids are going to fall down. So we need to provide a lot of support to just provide it. What NGSS is pushing is a meaning making. Students have to understand what it is. And once you're talking about meaning making, you cannot pull the L's back and say, here is a language sentence frame that you have to follow. The natural language has to go along with the making sense of science. So we are thinking of both different ways of a language. And so we're doing two things at the same time. And the funny thing for doctor students is that I'm talking to doctor students more. I'm sure that all the staff scholars will have your stories. So I thought that I did my previous line of research on English, science for English language learners, and I thought that I did the best work that I could think of. So I had a body of knowledge that I assumed that most of the people would cite. But that's a previous generation of the standards, and that's a previous generation of thinking of a language. It's much more static. Now that I have been making transition over the past 4 years into making sense of figuring things out and using language to communicate the ideas, I am at a point where when I go along the way for a couple more years, I may end up saying what I did was the best I could, but that was limited. So as a scholar, you may get to a point where you may say in the future that, oops, I have done the best I could at the time, and I'm learning better, and that's a very humbling experience.
Thank you very much.
I love your smile and nodding.